No fridges, no grocery stores, no 24/7 delivery apps. For over 90% of human history, there was no such thing as breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So what did a real day of eating actually look like for the people who came before us? The answer isn't just meat and berries. It's stranger, harder, and honestly, more interesting than anything on a modern menu. By the end of this video, you'll never look at your fridge the same way again. Let's start with the biggest myth of all, the idea that ancient humans ate 3 neat scheduled meals a day. They didn't. That entire concept, breakfast at 8, lunch at noon, dinner at 6, is surprisingly recent. It's mostly a product of industrial work schedules from the last couple hundred years, built around factory shifts and clock time. Before that, and for the vast majority of our species' existence, humans ate when food was available, not when a clock told them to. That could mean grazing on small amounts throughout the day while foraging. It could mean going 12, sometimes 18 hours with nothing at all. And then it could mean eating an enormous amount in one sitting after a successful hunt. Their bodies were built for feast or famine cycles, not the steady 3-meal grazing we do today. In fact, some researchers who study modern intermittent fasting look directly at these ancient eating patterns because our bodies may still be wired for that boom and bust rhythm, even though our lifestyles no longer match it. So picture a single day, way back in the Paleolithic era, roughly 2.5 million years ago, up until about 10,000 years ago. A typical morning wouldn't start with cereal. It would start with foraging, walking, searching, digging. Roots, tubers, wild greens, nuts, and seasonal fruit made up the bulk of what people actually ate. And here's the part that surprises most people. 60 to 80% of caloric intake for most hunter-gatherer groups came from plant foods, not meat. The image of a caveman gnawing on a mammoth leg is mostly Hollywood. In reality, plants were the reliable, everyday food. Meat was the exciting, unreliable bonus. By midday, if the group was in the right environment, insects were very often on the menu. Grubs, larvae, termites, even beetles, depending on the region. This wasn't a desperate last resort either. Insects were a dense, reliable source of protein and fat, easier to catch than a running animal, and available almost year-round in many climates. Some anthropologists estimate insects made up a meaningful chunk of protein intake in numerous hunter-gatherer societies, and in some parts of the world today, they still do. Then comes evening, and this is where things get unpredictable. If a hunt succeeded that day, the group ate meat. If it didn't, they didn't, and they simply relied on whatever had been foraged. This is the real mythbuster of the whole video. The caveman diet of pop culture, all steak and fire and mammoth ribs, was actually the exception, not the rule. Meat was a celebration, not a Tuesday dinner. Now, when a hunt did succeed, especially a large one, it wasn't a polite portion meal the way we think of dinner today. It was closer to a full tribe event, almost a festival. Here's why. There was no refrigeration, none. A large animal carcass would begin spoiling within hours, especially in warm climates. So the group's strategy was simple: eat as much as possible, as fast as possible, and share it across the whole tribe before it went bad. Some estimates suggest individuals could consume several thousand calories in a single sitting after a big kill, essentially loading up their bodies the way a bear might before winter. And nothing went to waste. This is something modern eating habits have almost completely lost. Organs, marrow, and fat were often prized more than the muscle meat we consider the good part today. Liver, heart, kidneys, all of it was eaten, and often eaten first because these parts are dense in vitamins, iron, and fat that muscle meat simply doesn't have. Bone marrow in particular is believed to have been something close to a delicacy. Cracking open a long bone and scooping out the rich, fatty marrow inside would have been one of the most calorie-dense, satisfying things a person could eat in an entire week. In a world where fat and calories were scarce and survival depended on them, marrow wasn't a garnish, it was gold. This is also roughly the point in history where cooking enters the picture, and it changes everything. Evidence of controlled fire use for food goes back at least 800,000 years. And some researchers argue it could be even older than that. Cooking meat and plants did more than make food taste better. It made food easier to digest, unlocked more calories from the same amount of food, and even likely played a role in the evolution of smaller human digestive tracts and larger brains, since cooked food requires less energy to break down internally. In a very real sense, learning to cook may have quite literally fueled human evolution. For hundreds of thousands of years, this foraging and hunting rhythm was essentially the only way humans ate. But then, around 10 to 12,000 years ago, everything changed with the agricultural revolution. Humans began deliberately planting and harvesting crops instead of only foraging for wild ones, and diets shifted dramatically toward grain, wheat, barley, rice, or maize, depending on the region of the world. And here's something that genuinely surprises people. This shift wasn't necessarily an upgrade for health. Meals became more repetitive and far less varied than the diverse forage diets that came before. Skeletal evidence from early farming communities actually shows more tooth decay, more nutrient deficiencies, and shorter average height compared to hunter-gatherer populations before them. In some ways, agriculture solved the problem of unpredictable food supply, but created a new problem of monotonous, less nutritious meals for most ordinary people. Bread and porridge-like grain mixtures became daily staples in this new farming world. And in a detail that always gets a reaction, beer is believed by many archaeologists to have been brewed even before bread was reliably baked. Fermented grain was easier to digest, helped preserve nutrients, and was safer to drink than untreated water in many settlements. So in the earliest farming villages, your daily meal might have quite literally included a mildly alcoholic grain drink, consumed by adults and sometimes even children as a basic part of everyday nutrition, not a luxury. Now let's fast forward to the civilizations most of us actually picture when we think ancient: Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome. This is the first point in human history where we start to see actual recorded, structured meal patterns, written down, documented, studied by historians today. In ancient Egypt, bread and beer formed the base of almost every single meal for almost every social class. Alongside that, people ate onions, garlic, and legumes like lentils and chickpeas, which were affordable, easy to grow along the Nile, and nutrient-dense. Meat, though, was a luxury. For most ordinary Egyptians, meat appeared only occasionally during festivals or celebrations. The wealthy and the priestly classes, on the other hand, had much more regular access to meat, along with wine and a far more varied diet overall. Food, quite literally, marked your place in society. In ancient Rome, we start to see something that looks a lot more like our modern meal structure. There was ientaculum, a quick breakfast, usually just bread with cheese or olives, eaten early and fast. Then prandium, a light midday meal, often just leftovers from the night before, nothing fancy. And then the real event of the day, cena, the evening meal. For ordinary Romans, cena might be simple: porridge, vegetables, maybe some bread. But for the wealthy, cena could stretch on for hours, multiple courses, exotic imported ingredients, elaborate seasoning, and yes, some famously excessive dishes that historians still find remarkable today. The gap between how the rich and the poor ate in Rome was enormous, arguably more extreme than in many modern societies. In ancient Greece, the pattern was simpler and more consistent across classes. Barley bread, olives, cheese, and wine were the true dietary staples eaten by almost everyone, rich or poor. Meat, interestingly, was primarily tied to religious life. It was often eaten only during sacrificial rituals, after which the meat would be cooked and shared communally among the people present. In other words, for many ordinary Greeks, eating meat was as much a spiritual and social event as it was a nutritional one. Salt is worth pausing on too, because it quietly shaped entire economies. Before refrigeration, salt was one of the only reliable ways to preserve meat and fish for the lean months. Roman soldiers were sometimes partially paid in salt, which is where the word salary comes from. Entire trade routes across the ancient world existed just to move salt from coastal regions inland, because a well-salted store of meat could mean the difference between surviving winter and starving through it. Spices tell a similar story. In the ancient world, flavor wasn't just about taste. It was about status and preservation. Pepper, cinnamon, and other imported spices traveled enormous distances along early trade networks, and owning them was a sign of wealth. For most people, though, daily flavor came from whatever grew locally: garlic, onion, herbs, vinegar, not exotic imports. And we can't talk about ancient eating without talking about the flip side: famine. Harvests failed, droughts hit, wars disrupted trade. For ordinary people across almost every ancient civilization, hunger wasn't a rare tragedy. It was a recurring, expected part of life, sometimes every few years. Communities developed grain storage systems, communal granaries, and rationing customs specifically because they knew abundance never lasted. That constant awareness of scarcity shaped religious rituals, harvest festivals, and even laws around food distribution in many ancient societies. So by the time we reach these civilizations, eating finally starts to resemble the structured, scheduled version of a day of meals that we recognize today. But it's important to notice what stayed the same underneath all that structure. Access to food, and especially to meat, fat, and variety, was deeply tied to wealth and class. The wealthy feasted. Everyone else largely subsisted on whatever grain, legumes, and bread their region could reliably produce. So pulling all of this together, what did ancient humans really eat in a day? For most of our species' long history, the honest answer is plants, insects, and whatever was seasonally and locally available, with meat as an unpredictable, exciting bonus rather than a daily guarantee. It wasn't romantic, and it definitely wasn't the clean, balanced three-meal structure we imagine today. It was constant adaptation, bodies and entire cultures built around uncertainty, scarcity, and the occasional overwhelming abundance of a successful hunt or a good harvest. And, in a strange way, that uncertainty may be exactly what shaped human biology into what it is today. Our tendency to crave fat and sugar, our ability to survive long gaps without food, even our social habit of gathering around a shared meal, all of it likely traces back to hundreds of thousands of years of eating exactly this way. If you want to see what ancient humans did after the sun went down, once the eating was done and the fire was still burning, I've got a video on that too right there. And if this changed the way you think about your next meal even a little, hit subscribe, because next time we're asking something even stranger. What did ancient humans do when someone in the tribe actually got sick?